Hi, and welcome back to the Dreaming and Doing podcast. I am super excited to be here today with Rae McDaniel, who is a non binary speaker, author, therapist, certified sex therapist, coach, and transgender diversity and inclusion educator. Rae helps audiences gain the sheer audacity to be themselves. And I'm really looking forward to hearing more about their book, Gender Magic, which is a first of its kind practical guide to achieving gender freedom. Rae, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here.
So, like I said before we started recording, I was really looking forward to talking with you. I might have mentioned when we first met that my first introduction to you and your work was I was listening to you on the Hello 7 podcast where you were talking about your sex therapy work. I am also trained in sex therapy. And then I heard you speak in Puerto Rico at ROI. And afterwards, we just happened to be hanging out with some of the same old people. Um, but also in listening to some of the talks that you've given on the podcast and also at ROI, I've discovered that one of the things you and I share in common is that we both grew up in the church and we both have a connection to puppets of all things.
Yes. Yes, I remember this when we met officially in Puerto Rico. For those of you who don't know me, like I grew up in a very evangelical Southern Baptist missionary family who worked with puppets as like a primary way that we, spread the gospel and whatnot. I'm not a religious person anymore, but it's rare to find somebody who had that same kind of Venn diagram of growing up. So I just remember nerding out and laughing really hard at that very strange fact that we shared with each other.
Yeah, it's not too often that it's something that you share or put out there openly like, "Oh, yes, I was, on a puppet team or whatever." It's just not one of those things you're sharing all the time.
Yeah, no, I don't typically lead with it, though it
Mhm.
really is an excellent addition to Two Truths and a Lie. I feel like I
Oh,
I have that game down.
I'm gonna have to keep that in mind and stick that one in my back pocket.
It's a good one.
Yes. Well, I have so many questions for you. So I'm gonna jump right in. So, um, I guess it was last year I heard you talk a little bit about your book and kind of what inspired you to write it and kind of how that journey unfolded. But I'm wondering if for everybody else, if you can talk about what inspired you to write your book, Gender Magic.
Yeah. So my first book, Gender Magic, came out in May of 2023, which I'm super excited about. The paperback is coming out this June, which I'm also really excited about. And it came about because working as a gender and sex therapist and as a queer person myself, I was working with a lot of trans folks. And I started noticing that most of the dialogue, most of the research, pretty much everything that I was reading was about trans suffering and how hard it is to be a trans person and all of the barriers that there are for trans people. And now we can't ignore that. That is absolutely real, especially given the current political moment that we're in. But what that conversation was missing for me was a discussion of what does it mean to have gender freedom? What does it mean to thrive as a transgender person or a non binary person? And I kept looking and looking for the resources and finally got to the point where I was like, well, I'm not exactly seeing the resource that I want. So I'm going to create it. So I developed a model for how I worked with trans folks called the Gender Freedom Model, which got published in an academic journal, which then became the backbone of my first book, Gender Magic, which is all about creating gender freedom for yourself, whether you are a trans person, a non binary person, simply questioning, or in addition, cisgender folks, so folks who aren't trans, who just want to bring more intention to how they relate to their own gender in the world.
Yes, I love that. And I'm wondering, well, I have lots of questions, but I'm wondering for you, what has it been like to put something so personal out there, right? I think even as therapists, our work can feel so personal. And so writing a book, same thing, right? You're putting something out there that you've committed so much time and energy and care into. What has it been like for you to put something so personal out into the world, both maybe the good, the not as exciting? How has that been?
Oh, such a juicy question. I think I had a lot of practice before Gender Magic came out, putting my personal information out on the interwebs. So I've
Mhm.
always been able to keep this line for myself when it comes to working with clients in therapy or in coaching, where when I'm in the room with somebody and we're working together, that is about them, completely about them. Like occasionally I might disclose a little bit of something about myself, but that is so focused on them. And the line that I created was when I'm outside of the therapy room, I feel comfortable sharing so much more about my life. And if my clients see that, great. Like, I don't have a problem with that. It's more of, hey, you now know this thing about me that you know informs how I show up in the room, which also attracted my ideal
Mhm.
client to me. But when I'm in the room, that focus is not on me. And so I had some practice putting out personal stories on the internet. So I think that kind of prepped me a little bit. The other thing that I am very intentional about in my writing is that I write from a place of therapeutic, not therapy. And what that means to me is that I am not going to share a story that I have not done enough work on, that I feel like I have a little bit of distance from it. So even though I was sharing a lot of vulnerable things and very personal things, those are things that I've worked on in my own therapy for a long time. There are things that I didn't feel necessarily emotionally activated by anymore. And so that creates a distance that I think is really helpful. The other thing is people's reactions to me putting out Gender Magic, to me putting even personal stories on, say, Instagram or something like that, and hearing the impact that it has on somebody else. That just reminds you of your why. I think
Hmm.
one critical mindset that I had to develop is that even when I share things about myself or personal stories, that is not about me. That is a story in service of the message that I am trying to put out there. And so it doesn't get as wrapped up in your ego.
Hmm. I love that distinction. And so I'm wondering, knowing kind of the literature that you were seeing available to people before, right? Talking about the struggles and the challenges and the hardships. And you were like, that's not the book I want to write. That's not what this is about. I just imagine that so many people would be like, yes, that's exactly what I want for myself. And I'm wondering, how have people received your book?
It's so interesting being an author and having people that I've never met, never spoken to, send me private messages to say how the book has impacted their life. Um, I try to, and this is going to sound maybe like really cheesy and a little woo, but try to stay in the miracle of,
Hmm.
wow, like people are being impacted by my work in ways that in my wildest dreams imagined, but to see that come into reality is something that is really special. And it's something that I try to hold on to. I keep a folder of the things that people send me so that I can look back on it and just see all of it in one place. But it's connected me back to the why of why I do this work, of why I put so much effort and time into creating a resource in a book like Gender Magic, is to see these reactions. So it's just been amazing and really special and very heartwarming. And there has been more than a few tears, that's for sure.
Hmm. Yes, I love that. So your book is about achieving gender freedom. For anyone who's listening and is wondering, like, what in the world does that even mean? How do you define gender freedom?
So, gender freedom is the ability to understand, name, and express your gender authentically in the world without fear of shame or violence or pain or suffering. And we know that that is something that on a macro level at society, we have a lot of work to
Mhm.
do. My work focuses more on that internal sense of what does it mean to create gender freedom for yourself, acknowledging all of the systemic barriers that we have, but not staying stuck there.
Mhm.
So, whether you are trans or non binary or questioning or cisgender, gender freedom is a term that encompasses all of those identities because all of us, from even before we are born, right? There's research showing that somebody will talk to a baby in a womb differently if you tell them it is a boy or a girl. So, this is something that influences everyone. um, Gender freedom is about, hey, how do I want to show up in the world? How do I understand who I am when it comes to gender? And how do I want to express that to the world? And that is a valuable question for self growth for everyone and
Mhm.
not just trans folks, which is why I also named the introduction of Gender Magic Transition Isn't the Point, because
Mhm.
ultimately, it's not. It's about creating freedom for ourselves. And ultimately, how do we, or what happens, like this curiosity of what happens in the world when more people feel that they can show up as themselves without fear or shame.
Mhm. And I think that that's such an interesting point because, in my work as a therapist, there are so many people who struggle with being authentic or owning their worth. So many people believe that they are broken or believe that they are unworthy. And your book and the work that you do helps people gain the sheer audacity to be themselves in the world, right? So knowing that just being ourselves sometimes is an audacious act. But I'm wondering, from your perspective, if you can talk with us about the audacity of authenticity and why it's so important and why so many people struggle with it.
Yes, yes. So I love the term audacity, and my business is also called Practical Audacity, my therapy practice. And it's because this word, it has this dual meaning, right? There is this kind of pearl clutching, like how dare they? They have the audacity to do this thing. But there's also this other meaning of it that's much more positive, which is doing what feels authentic without regard for other people's opinions. And
Hmm.
that takes bravery in our world because we are in these systems, whether we've talked about that high macro societal system, all the way down to the families that we grow up in that expect certain things of us, that expect us to behave in certain ways in order to keep things peaceful and pleasant.
Hmm.
And audacity is saying, I don't actually have to do what others expect of me, that it is actually more important for me to do what is authentic to me. And what does that look like in the world?
Yes, I love that. Which is such an important message, right? How many times are we worried about what other people will think, other people's opinions? And so, really being grounded in that sense of doing what is authentic and what is aligned for us. And so, I know that you said a lot of your work and your book is about helping people with the internal stuff. And I have some questions for you about the external, if that's all right.
Absolutely.
And so, obviously there's that internal work, right? Of being authentic and allowing ourselves to authentically be ourselves and also the work around gender freedom. And I'm wondering, right? What are the struggles that you see in our communities, organizations, or society overall in accepting other people's us authentic selves? When people are like, I'm trying to put myself out there, I'm trying to be authentic. And then we see these outside systems that are like, I don't know about that.
Oh, such a big question. We can't ignore, like I've said, this current political moment that we're in which we're about to see in this next election. One of the linchpin issues is transgender rights.
Hmm.
And there are a record number of anti-trans laws that are being passed and being tried to be being passed, especially targeting transgender children and young adults.